Welcome back to the Fuse Show, everybody. I'm joined by my guest, Taha Dar. Taha's the founder and CEO of SearchSmartly, which is an award-winning prop tech startup backed by Founders Factory. He has a diverse background in technology, strategy, and finance, and previously worked in the world of Formula One at the Red Bull Racing F1 team. He holds a master's in Aeronautical Engineering from Imperial College and an MBA from the London Business School. Welcome to the show.
Hey Jim, thanks for having me.
So let's jump right into this. Tell me a little bit more about what Search Smartly is and what you guys do.
Great. How we live and how we work has been changing, before our eyes over the last year and a half. And consumers are rethinking where and how they wish to live. And this has been accelerating a pre-COVID shift that we've seen towards lifestyle-centric living and lifestyle-centric property search. There's no platform out there that solves for these emerging consumer priorities, forcing people to spend more than 100 hours of time in very frustrating, very time-consuming property search. And Search Smartly is trying to solve this problem by using unique technology to reimagine and simplify that property matchmaking experience, because we really believe it is a matchmaking process. And we do this by doing the heavy lifting to uncover the homes that are deeply suited to each unique person's individual, let's say, hyper-personal needs, whether it's commutability, access to green space, good local schools, lively local neighborhood, good air quality, and so on. And in doing so, our platform is trying to help consumers obviously find the right home 10 times faster than traditional property search experiences, while generating leads for the supply side of the market, your realtors and estate agents, that convert up to 5 times better than the status quo. So essentially, we're building a much more efficient marketplace, saving people time and generating better quality leads for the supply side of the market. Ultimately, our long-term vision is to build the global operating system for highly personal property search in this post-COVID world that we're moving into.
That's phenomenal. Good timing, I would say, as well, with COVID. As ironic as that is, I imagine that the
Yeah.
timing has been pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. The trends that we had seen towards hyper personalization, people thinking about their underlying needs, go back almost 10 years, and they've been sort of growing over a long period of time. And we observed a few years back that there really was no sort of platform out there that was solving for these emerging, let's say, flexible, location flexible needs.
I see.
And then COVID accelerated that trend massively because if you think about it, many people are thinking about, well, what if I commute maybe 2 days a week to the office and I'm
Mhm.
working from home the rest of the time? Do I really need to be within, let's say, 30 minutes of the office? Maybe I can trade a longer commute for the other things that I care about, whatever those might be. And that's moving more and more people in this direction where when you come into the start of that property search experience, you don't necessarily always know exactly which area you want to live in. And that's sort of a trend that's moving away from traditional property search.
Yeah.
So yeah, in a way, COVID is accelerating this prior trend. But like you said, I think we were in a way fortunate that timings worked out the way they did, because if the company was started maybe 5, 10 years earlier, maybe things wouldn't have worked out the way they have
Sure.
this time around.
Yeah. So right now you're operating in London only, is that correct?
We're primarily London centric. We cover the southeast of England, so London and the home counties, as they're called, the sort of the
Okay.
various boroughs and neighborhoods immediately surrounding London. We started sort of onboarding partners in cities outside of London as well. So we have some limited presence in other major cities in the UK. But
Okay.
our goal really is post Series A to sort of ramp up that expansion.
Now, is it your intent that, do you see this working well in other developed countries?
Yeah, totally. So our long-term vision is building that operating system that allows the same way of searching to happen in other urbanized locations. We kind of think that the way Search Smartly works and the way we help people discover places, initially it's going to be something that works best in urban and suburban areas. But there we have a very strong belief, and we've seen evidence already around this, that this way of searching can work in other locations. And we've actually had inbound interest from very diverse parts of the world to take our technology and sort of apply it in other cities and other countries. So it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves, but we're very, very sort of convinced that this is actually the future of the way people will find a place to live. I mean, a process that hasn't evolved very much for a very, very long time, I think
Yeah.
there's a really interesting opportunity ahead.
It's a brilliant idea, and I can't imagine, that somebody would use your platform and then not want to use it in the future. Like not want to get all the things on their list.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the way I kind of think about this is when you go into a property search, you go in with some prior knowledge, areas that you've previously visited,
Yeah.
maybe places your friends live in, places you've lived in, and you start with a certain level of knowledge. But whenever you go through a change in your life, whether it's changing jobs, changing cities or countries, having a family, moving in with
Hmm.
someone, buying your first home, anytime a major change happens in your life, that knowledge resets to some degree, where you're kind of in a slightly different set of circumstances, where your
Right.
prior knowledge may be less effective in this new scenario that you find yourselves in. Let's say you move in with your partner, your husband or your wife, and now you need to solve for multiple commutes. Well,
Hmm.
areas you previously lived in may no longer be suitable for those two completely different commutes. And so it's those situations where we think Search Smartly can create the most value. And it's those situations which are currently happening on the dinner table, talking to lots of friends, on
Hmm.
Reddit, on a website called Mumsnet in the UK. There's all these different platforms that people go to solve for that information sort of gap that happens whenever you undergo this change in circumstances. And Search Smartly wants to be the product that solves for that information gap, solves for these unstructured, disparate conversations that you're having in these different environments, solving it with a product.
Yeah. Well, it makes perfect sense, and I can definitely see the need for that. Tell me about the genesis of the idea to start this.
Yeah, it's as with many sort of startups, it was born out of just pure personal frustration. I moved to the UK when I was in sort of school, in high school, and sort of coming out of high school, I started studying at university or college in London as well. And generally, with UK universities, you don't really get housing on campus. You're kind of on your own after the first year. So every year, 4-year course, you move three times typically as a student. And so each of those 3 years, I was back out in the housing market trying to figure out the right place to live, and had many frustrating experiences as a student because the way the housing market works in the UK, students typically have a higher barrier that they need to pass in terms of financial qualification because you're not earning an income. And so
Yeah.
it really limits your options. And so when you have limited options, you have to make big compromises on location. So, trying to solve for that was very frustrating. But then after university, I ended up moving out of London to a place I'd never lived before called Milton Keynes. And that was an even more frustrating experience because I did not know the area at all. I'd got this, dream job working for a Formula One team in Milton Keynes, but didn't know the area at all. So I had to do a lot of research to try and figure out the areas that would sort of best meet my personal needs. And I kind of had three requirements. I was really flexible, but there's three things I cared about. One was a sensible commute because this was a job that you know, I had sort of structured my entire sort of university studies and early career around getting. So now I wanted to make the most of it. So I wanted to have a
Yeah.
short commute. I knew I'd be working weekends, so it was all about just making sure that it was manageable from that perspective. I'm really into running, so I wanted to have some green space nearby. And the last thing was, just having some shops, supermarkets nearby, which you can easily take for granted in a place like Milton Keynes. It's
Mm.
built like your suburban US towns, massive spaces between sort of neighborhoods.
I see.
You need a car to get around, otherwise you're pretty much landlocked within your local neighborhood. And I didn't
Mm.
have a car. So I had a very frustrating experience, ended up living in an area initially which really didn't have access to any of those amenities that I wanted nearby.
Mm.
And I ended up having to move out of that home as soon as my notice period came up because I just felt completely trapped. There was nothing around me, nothing to do. It was just work and a park and nothing else. So I sort of kind of thought about, what if I had access to better data, better information before I went into my search process, so I could have just focused my search on areas that would have those amenities locally and kind
Yeah.
of go in with my eyes sort of fully open. And so off the back of that experience, I just started paying more attention to how people around me thought about their property search.
Hmm.
And when I joined this company, I was one of the younger people. They had sort of recently started doing these industrial placement schemes, which I was sort of a part of. So you take fresh university graduates or current students into the program. And so a lot of younger people started joining this company. And as I would kind of just ask them questions about how they were thinking about their property search, I began to just see this recurring trend where amongst a lot of the people I spoke to, there was this underlying set of needs, and it changed from person to person, but there was this deeper set of requirements. People with kids cared more about having good schools nearby and
Yeah.
having green space that they could spend time in. The younger crowd was more into, accessibility to places like London and
Yeah.
sort of, restaurants, cafes, gyms, and that sort of thing. And there was these underlying needs that just kept coming up. So the idea behind Search Smartly was, what if we flipped the process on its head? Rather than you picking a neighborhood and then diving deep into the properties to see how far away is the nearest tube station, how far away are the nearest cafes, and then realizing it's not a good fit, and then repeating that process again and again, what if we flipped the whole thing on its head and said, what really matters to you? And how can we surface those specific homes and prioritize those homes that
Hmm.
fit that criteria on that fundamental level? And so that's where the genesis of Search Smartly was born. And I was just hoping someone would build it. A bit naively, I thought, someone's going to do it. Surely, eventually, it'll exist. But no one did. And I could just see that the problem was becoming sort of more and more apparent to me. And I just became obsessed with that problem. So eventually, I decided to leave my job at this Formula One team, and then decided to study for my MBA and use that as an opportunity to sort of test this idea, build my network. Coming from a very technical engineering background, I needed to sort of build my own sort of relationships outside of the world of engineering, potentially raise investment from angels,
Hmm.
learn more about the softer side of business, building relationships, sales,
Yeah.
and so on and so marketing, how do you get this idea out there? And so for me, an MBA felt like a safer way of sort of ideating and sort of taking this idea to market. So
I
that's sort of
see.
the path that I took, and that was working on Search Smartly essentially while studying for my MBA.
Okay. The world was just waiting on you to solve this problem.
It seems like
I'm,
it.
I'm glad you stepped up and did that. That's fantastic. I think that this is the genesis story of the most successful startups in the world. It's this obsession with the problem and solving that problem that allows people to get traction and really it creates the staying power as well that's
Yeah,
necessary to get through all the
totally.
challenges of a
The hard
startup.
days. Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you. This is a little bit out of left field, but since you bring it up, I'm curious. So it looks like you've been out of your MBA program for about 3 years now. Would you take that path again? Was it worthwhile in terms of the investment of time and expense?
Yeah, for me, when you think about MBAs, sometimes, people go in thinking, okay, well, I want to change in career or change in geography or change in function. And other times people don't really know exactly what they want to get out of it. They want to explore different paths and different options. For me, it was like super clear. Like I had one goal from beforehand going into the MBA, that I wanted to come out the other side validating whether this idea was going to be worth it. And for me, I was able to de-risk that sort of proposition because I got really fortunate with getting a scholarship, which basically paid for the cost of the MBA. So on
Wow.
that sort of risk reward
Yeah.
um, sort of balance, it seemed like a really sort of no brainer sort of way to go out there and say, well, here's a risk effective way of proving the idea works, and also from a personal level learning a lot along the way, not just building
Sure.
the business but also the formal sort of education that comes with an MBA
Hmm.
and the network building that comes with an MBA. If you put yourself in my shoes, everyone that I knew was an engineer. I did not know anyone building startups, and I did not know anyone who was investing in startups. I didn't know anyone who was working in startups as such. And so it's a really high, information barrier to jump on your own.
You're right.
Obviously you can do it, but
Yeah.
if you have an environment like a sandbox that just says, here are
Sure.
all the resources, and you can run with it. You can even take this idea through various, let's say, formal frameworks of pitching competitions and so on and so forth. again, you could probably do that on your own without the support of an MBA, and obviously many people have, but it
Sure.
was just sort of perfect, sort of perfectly primed, and the cost of it was lowered massively by the benefit of the scholarship. So for me, it
Yeah.
seemed like a very sensible sort of thing to do. And yeah, if I could go
Sure.
back, I'd definitely do it again.
Well, tell me about the LBS incubator, because I mean that was probably a turning point as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, by the time by the time graduation came around, Search Smartly as an idea was now being sort of explored across various different sort of frameworks. So, we had sort of figured out, is there a willingness to pay amongst buyers, in our case, realtors, estate agents? Is there a need amongst consumers? Is this a real problem that we're solving? Can the technology exist? There was a real technical challenge that we needed to validate. If you flip search on its head,
Mm-hmm.
can you run a search process or an algorithm that's fast enough to deliver results in real time the way consumers expect it? So those basic questions had been validated by that point while studying, during the MBA. But it was just me and an early co-founder and our first hire at that point. And so by the time we graduated, the incubator was an opportunity that came up that we applied to, which was to take things to that next formal level and almost have that, as with incubators, having that seal of approval, the brand mark on your, let's say, on your company CV that says you're part of
Mm-hmm.
something
Yeah.
official.
Yeah.
And we found that that was really helpful because we were going into that stage where we had done those three initial de-risking exercises, but to take the idea to the next stage, to really start onboarding more partners onto the platform for supply and raising that next round of funding to build, a real V1 of the product and not just a prototype,
Mm-hmm.
we needed to go out there and raise capital. And so having, on a very basic level, support of the incubator and being a part of the incubator, that was really, really crucial. We found that, it opened a lot of doors for us, investors, agents that we were working with. Yeah, I really liken it to having, a big name brand on your CV that says, okay, well, someone else has done the DD. This must be legitimate.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and that was a challenge that we definitely saw amongst investors, amongst clients, being risk averse, and then being able to look at this sort of badge of approval that says, okay, well, there is something that's de-risking this proposition. So that was in its own sense one really important sort of piece of support. And then also we were able to get that sort of office space, which was central London based, which just meant that when it came down to like, pitching to those early clients and stuff like that, we could just go around the local neighborhoods, walking into different offices, pitching to them directly. It just made that really accessible. And then finally, I would say the other big part of the incubator was the other founders within it. Um, there were 11 companies, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in the
Okay.
incubator, all at different sort of stages. And we had these sort of roundtable sessions every few weeks, which was all the founders in a room, a little cramped room, all sort of, shoulder to shoulder, sharing some of the challenges that we had faced, and then going around the room to kind of sort of see if we could collectively, use our hive mind to sort of solve those problems. And you'd be surprised how often other people, other founders had been through that exact same problem and the different angles they would come at in
Yeah.
terms of potentially solving it.
Well, it's easy for us to get into this situation where we can't see the forest because of the trees,
Mm-hmm.
and I like to call that outside eyes, where there's just a different perspective that comes in. And I found that it's useful. I have friends in different types of businesses from mine, and they offer a very unique perspective. So it doesn't even need to be
Mm-hmm.
the same type of business, but there's just such incredible value in that network and just
Yeah.
getting outside eyes onto problems.
Mm, totally, totally. And also, I would say, sometimes, we're not, as founders, we're not sort of engineered to admit it, but sometimes we think we know the solution, but we're not super comfortable, but we're never going to say to anyone on our team, I'm not really confident about this.
Yeah.
And so having another sort of pair of sort of, eyes running through that idea and saying, well, actually, yes, this is how I would solve it, and providing that second point of validation gives you
Yeah.
a bit more confidence to kind of dive into it fully. So that's always helpful
Yeah.
as well. And finally, being a founder is can be a lonely experience.
So
When
true.
you have your deepest, darkest fears, you can't go to your team about that. You can't always go to your investors about that. You can't always go to your family and your partners about that as well, because ultimately, it's you want to make sure that everyone feels like everything's heading in the right direction. So yeah, who do you go to? Having other
Yeah,
founders to speak to sometimes is the best solution.
I agree. Yeah. So what is your day-to-day role at Search Smartly?
Yeah, I mean that's evolved massively over time, and
Hmm.
as we've kind of grown the team, it's been as much about delegation as anything else, and I guess that trend will continue. Starting off, did basically everything.
Yeah.
Designed the initial sort of algorithms that underlie our matchmaking algorithm, and so on and so forth. Before the company existed, I spent time designing our first landing page and stuff like that. So there's some technical involvement, but now it's evolved over time, and we have various squads or functions within the company. So we have a product team, and I sort of essentially line manage product. So I am the internal product manager, or CPO if you want to call it that. So I look after product. um, and then I've worked very closely with our COO Hess, on other parts of the business. So she heads up our um, operations and partnerships functions. So operations is kind of dealing with the inquiries and viewing requests that we get. Partnerships is basically onboarding more suppliers onto the platform, as well as looking at potential demand side partnerships, working with relocation companies and so on and so forth. So those functions are still sort of really nebulous. We don't really know the what the playbook looks like yet
Hmm.
for those parts of the business. So with that piece, we kind of play it by ear. We work very closely around that. So I spend a lot of time in partnerships, sort of basically pushing forward conversations and sort of trying to win suppliers onto the platform and reaching out to them, leveraging a lot of the work that Hess does on that side. So she's built, essentially our sales pipeline process,
Okay.
and I execute on it. So a lot of my time is spent on sort of pitching to agents, trying to convince them to come on board, and sort of getting more supply on the platform. And then on top of that, sort of managing our marketing and growth team, sort of giving them that sort of mentorship and direction, but they are fairly sort of independent in that sense.
I see.
And then when it comes to fundraising and sort of, being the communicational front of the company when it comes to pitching, fundraising, PR, those sort of things, I either get involved in, or when in the case of fundraising, essentially own. So in a way, I'm also that sort of CFO within the company as
Hmm.
well. So, right now my role can vary quite a lot, and I try and sort of time box it within a typical week. Today I'm going to try and focus on these two things and try and not get distracted by
Yeah.
investor conversations or this stuff, and sort of try and sort of keep on top of things that way.
Is it fair to say that you figured out how to sell? Because it doesn't look like sales is necessarily in your background.
Yeah, no, it's been, for me personally, one of the most interesting things, even, during the course of my studies and the MBA process. One of the things that I just found really, really interesting was the psychology of business. So
Hmm.
whether it's managing behavior within your own organization or, sales, it's very psychological. There's this emotional component to it. I just find it super, super fascinating. And I think coming from a place where, I'm genuinely passionate about this problem, even though I don't have a sales sort of background, I just love speaking to investors, and I love speaking to agents, and just telling them about what we're building and how we're trying to solve it. Although conceptually, I don't see myself as a salesperson at all. I mean, if you look at me on the, um, you know, on the MBTI psychological profile, I'm definitely not your average salesperson.
Yeah.
But I just love talking about what we're doing, and just having conversations with investors and with agents. And so it kind of lends to a different type of sales, I would say. It comes from, I think, a genuine place of wanting to solve the problem, as opposed to wanting to push forward, a specific solution or a specific package. And we are
Yeah.
very collaborative. And when we speak to potential partners and clients, we try and take a collaborative approach, just trying to understand their problems and seeing what we can do to solve it.
Yeah. I think that type of person actually makes for the best salesperson, and I feel like that, I mean, it's obviously anecdotal, but I feel like that, 95+% of the sales training material out there is just garbage, where it's, manipulative, trying to talk somebody into something they're not interested in. It's like
Hmm.
misaligned incentives. It just doesn't work. And sadly, because of that, sales just in general has a negative reputation. And it's been our experience that the best salespeople don't have any of that baggage. They just have a genuine interest in the problem and a
Yeah.
genuine interest in the people that they're talking to, and making sure that it's truly a right fit, that it's a win-win,
Mm.
not just, oh, I'm going to talk you into this solution.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally agree with you on that. What we're trying to do is figure out what that playbook looks like so we can then eventually sort of operationalize that and make it more scalable. Because at the end of the day, as a founder, you can only scale so far. And so we're at that stage where with different processes in the business, we're trying to understand what works, what doesn't work, and sort of can we make that a bit more scalable? Can we sort of get the processes in place and obviously hire the right people who are equally sort of passionate about
Mm-hmm.
the underlying problem? And if you combine those two things together, then I think that's really the ultimate sort of ingredient to having a successful sales team.
Yeah. One of the things that we're working on implementing at our organization is EOS. Are you familiar with that platform?
No, I'm not.
It stands for the Entrepreneur's Operating System. It's basically a framework through which you run the business. So it has you set up your like vision, core focus, 3-year plan, 10-year plan, et cetera. But it provides clarity on what you're about as a company, and the idea is to help
Mm,
capture or share that passion with future
yes.
team members to make sure that
Mm,
everybody's in alignment.
yeah, makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've recently gone through an exercise with Founders Factory, to really sort of clarify, the vision, the mission, as well as the recursive strategy to the business. And so the
Mhm.
concept of recursive strategy was quite interesting because it says, in 4 or 5 steps, where are we starting from? Where do we ultimately want to go? And what are those key steps which sort of reinforce each other that need to be taken to get from point A to that sort of ultimate end goal? How we're
Mhm.
going to break those steps down into 4 or 5 key, I wouldn't say milestones, but key sort of, um, you know, processes. Like, what are we going to build first? What will that unlock? What will
Yeah.
that new position allow us to then do next? And how will that ultimately get us that final goal that we're aiming to achieve? And it's almost like adding layers to an onion, so to speak. And if you can clarify that, it's almost like a simple single 1-page document
Mhm.
that you can put together. And it's very
Yeah.
easy to understand. And the team that you share it with can very quickly understand, where are we going and how are we going to get there. And once you have that sort of clear picture, you can very easily understand what should we be prioritizing now versus what can come later. Because what step are we on right now in that sort of 4 to 5 step process.
Yeah.
And that's been really helpful for us as well. And even our product management process is evolving into that sort of now, next, later sort of structure. So it becomes really easy for us to know what to prioritize. Because that, as we've been growing and trying to grow faster, one thing that's become obviously super clear to me is prioritization is key. Knowing what to do and when to do it, is super, super important. And you have to get
Yeah.
that right.
I was up late last night reading an article. This is on product, but it's also really mostly on core focus. And have you heard of Heaton Shaw from Kissmetrics?
I've heard of Kissmetrics, but I haven't read much of Heaton stuff.
Yeah. So if you type into Google Heaton Bombs, it's Hiten. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Heaton Bombs. He wrote a fantastic article on Product Habits blog, but basically he was telling about the story of the early days of Kissmetrics, and they really
Mm.
had he estimated a 3-year lead when it comes to product on their competitors. They found something that
Yeah.
worked, and he kept being distracted by all these different ideas, these shiny ideas that he would pursue, and eventually lost trust with the company. And he called these Heaton bombs, where it's they would lose focus on their core focus as a business.
Mm.
And he said, like, he calls it his $1 billion mistake, where they
Mm.
lost traction and eventually just didn't do nearly as well as what
Yeah.
they were forecast or expected to do. So I'm curious how you think of that, and how you prioritize. What is your core focus and what are the most important things, and then how do you assess if this is a worthy pursuit or if it's just a distraction that's going to take me and my team away from our core focus.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and I think we're still trying to get a handle on that, to be honest with you. Because, when we ask our users for feedback and we ask our internal team for feedback, it can, if you look at it on a holistic level, it could take you in completely different directions. So
Mhm.
how do we pick which direction to go in?
Yeah.
And going through this exercise on a very strategic level, this sort of recursive strategy approach was quite helpful because it helped us understand what direction unlocks the most opportunity. Let's say you go in a particular direction, what optionalities does that create in terms of other
Mhm.
things you could do if you headed in that general direction? And that's one way to think about it. If I think about, like, some companies have done this really cleverly. You look at companies like Boston Dynamics, like the guys who built those robots that you see all over on YouTube and stuff like that.
Yeah.
you know from what I understand it, they had a very clear vision as to what they as a company wanted to do, and they basically took on government DARPA contracts and stuff like that basically helped them go in that direction. If they were to try and raise capital to solve immediately for that problem, they probably end up, you know, raising a huge amount of money and diluting themselves massively, and perhaps not
Mhm.
solving the problem in as efficient a way as possible. But they figured out, what are those general initiatives that are out there that move us in that same direction that we would like to go in. And so that's kind of the approach that we've taken, or we are taking now a little bit more. What is that general direction that we want to be going in, and how do we get there? And so for us, practically what that means is having a clear idea as to who our target user personas are. Property search sounds like a very general problem, and it would be for everyone because everyone needs to find a place to live.
Mhm.
But we are focused on 3 or 4 ideal user personas, and that's it. And these are fairly narrow segments that we're just focusing on what's most useful for these users, and not trying to get too distracted by the other stuff that could be helpful. We know that those other things are there, and we might do them further down the line, but kind of having that now, next, later framework for product, or never. We haven't. I don't think we're quite at that comfortable enough to the point where we say never. It's
Yeah.
still one of those things where it's like, well, it sounds like a great idea. Maybe let's put it in the later column.
Uh-huh.
But at least that gives us an initial starting point to say this is really important. It's going to have a high impact for those specific users,
Mhm.
and it's low risk. So let's do it now.
Sure.
Here's something that's high impact, but there's also a lot of risk around it. We need to kind of either do more user interviews, or we need to kind of validate some of these assumptions. Let's put it in the next column. And stuff that is potentially lower impact, we'll look at that later because it doesn't
Yeah.
really align with the users that we're focused on. And I think that structure, at least in terms of what to build and when to build it, has given us a lot more clarity. And now we're just trying to figure out that cadence of exactly how to sort of use that approach on a weekly or monthly basis. Like, how do we embed that into our user interview process? How do we embed that
Mhm.
into our sprint planning process? That's kind of where we are right now,
Makes
sort of
sense.
navigating that question.
Yeah. I'm curious how you're evolving as a founder. And I had this paradigm shift the other day. We're at just over 40 full-time employees at our organization now. And, when you start out, you've got to wear all the different hats. And that's just necessary. And you've got to impart your vision to the team. But I had this paradigm shift on the way home the other day. I thought, I'm the bottleneck now. I am standing in the way
Mm.
of growth. And it's not that I don't trust, but it's like I'm not letting go of different areas of the business fast enough. So it's hindering us. And I just thought, like, I need to let go of more, but it's like, it takes an awareness, I think, of that, and knowing, and discernment and good judgment, knowing when to let go of certain areas and then what to
Mm.
hold on to. And basically right
Yeah.
now my focus is like, well, I'm going to hold on to selling. And the nature of our business is we have like very high LTV, and like I could theoretically sell forever, right? Like that could be the highest and best use
Mm.
of my time for a very long time because of the nature of our business. But there's other things that I've been doing that have just taken me away from the highest and best use of my time. So I'm curious
Yeah.
how you see that in yourself, and how you've evolved and continue to evolve as a founder.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, like you said, the biggest challenge is recognizing that holding on to something isn't the best use of your time. Um, so, I mean, there's things today that I do that just genuinely aren't a good use of my time, like, financial admin and accounting and that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, part of our plan for, our next raise is thinking about, like, what are those things that can just get sort of, um, you know, um, sort of spread out within the team and sort of delegate it out essentially. And where does my time ultimately, create the most value? I think probably, sales, whether it's effectively selling to investors or selling to clients, those are areas
Yeah.
that are probably I'll still sort of be very closely involved with. And we have definitely still seen that there's a halo effect when people speak to the CEO. Um,
Yeah.
so until we can unravel that, whether it's through improving our proposition further and building deeper integrations with potential clients to make sure that things just flow more smoothly. Until that happens, it's inevitable that I will definitely be at least part of that process.
Hmm.
Product is just something that's super close to my heart, but I'm not necessarily the best product manager around. So, I can very much see that there's a need for a product manager in the business. That's something that's most likely going to happen, when we raise that next round. So, yeah, I think it's just one of those really, really interesting things. And I think already, as a business, once Hess came on board, our COO, she took on a lot of things that I was previously doing,
I
and that
see.
was just massively helpful. And I think just recognizing that my role fundamentally in the company is to hire people that are more capable, smarter than me in the areas that matter, and empowering them to do their best. And we've
Yeah.
definitely seen that work wonders in various roles that I have handed over. The stuff that I've given to Hass, stuff that our first designer picked up, our first QA engineer picked up. Just things just run so much smoother when you're not blocking processes.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and I think that's the recognition that is necessary. And thankfully, I'm not very precious about these sort of things, so um, I've kind of come to that recognition really early on. But I think a lot of founders have that sort of trust thing, like, can you
Mhm.
trust someone to take something which is critical and run with it? Can you let go? Can you learn to let go? Um, and I think you can only come to that realization once you test it out, once you try it out. And I think, like, in that sense, having Hess on board was really helpful because this isn't her first startup. She was one of the first hires at a company that's sort of that had already been through that growth journey. She
I see.
grew their product team from inception to, I think, over 100 engineers over a
Wow.
couple of years. And so she had gone through that sort of the pain points of scaling a business really quickly. And so when she came on board, having her say, look, you're going to go through these problems in the next 1 to 2 years. So just keep that in mind.
Mhm.
You are going to need a designer. You are going to need a QA. Keep those things in mind as someone who is in product. Um, that was really helpful. And I think even speaking to, working with our investors who themselves are in many cases entrepreneurs and founders themselves,
Mhm.
leaning on them for advice as well, I think is really important. So I think, for any other founders out there who are kind of navigating those challenges, figuring out, what experiments can you run to see if something is ready to let go is really important. Can you codify the process enough that you can then hand over to someone else and run it? Even, hiring, something that I would just do and be fully involved with from start to finish. We realized that I didn't need to be in the first round or in the second round. Yes,
Yeah.
as a founder, you do want to make sure that there is that final, that cultural fit. So you might want to be in a final round interview. Um,
Sure.
but do you need to do the initial screening or not? And so, we were able to kind of codify that hiring process to the extent that, our interns were running the hiring process, which is, you'd be surprised as to how quickly we're able to get to that sort of stage, and it's worked well for us. So I think, yeah, figuring out what you can sort of codify and make it repeatable and replicatable.
Yeah.
That's sort of the missing ingredient, I think, for a lot of people handing over a process
Sure.
to others.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, back to sales, and you mentioned the halo effect and this idea of, people wanting to speak to the founder or, well, generally, yeah, the founder.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with VSLs, video sales letters?
I know, no.
Here's one thing that's interesting that I've noticed. So, like we're talking about how a lot of salespeople just don't connect well, and there's this negative reputation there. It's like David, my co-founder, and I have bought various products for our business in spite of the salesperson, not because of them. And I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, but like it happens. And the reason why is because the founder has demonstrated competence in other means, whether that's via, podcast interviews or
Mm,
via a video sales letter, which is basically a long form videos, sales presentation in a way, but it's a presentation of their competence in that
mm,
space where they're laying out. We're talking this could be well over an hour long, where they're laying out their ethos and the passion for the idea, the product, et cetera, and really making that connection. So the idea is that people would consume that material before a sales call. So you're literally building trust asynchronously, and then the
mm.
salesperson doesn't have that same burden of responsibility. And it's a
Yeah,
way that you can kind of multiply yourself so you don't have to be on every
yeah,
single call.
yeah,
But it's
yeah.
just interesting. Like it's an interesting concept that we've actually seen work pretty well.
Interesting. And is that something that you tend to see like embedded in initial emails before, the sales call is booked in and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, also just on your website. But yes, the idea is like
Mm,
the idea is that before you get on a sales call, we like to present all of the information that's available. So our pricing, et cetera. So like what I want to avoid is we get on a call with somebody, talk for 30 minutes, share the price. Like, oh, well, that's way too expensive for me. It's like, well,
mm,
it's like, what was the point of us having this
yeah,
conversation if we could have saved their time by presenting
yeah.
this information ahead of time? So,
Mm,
but then it provides that opportunity to scale the sales team, but still
yeah.
employ the halo effect to some extent, and it's actually quite useful. Yeah, it's being sold before the actual conversation. So it's an interesting thing
Yeah.
to consider.
Yeah.
Um, so, man, this has been a great conversation, Taha, and I really appreciate your time. I feel like that we could talk for a couple hours on so many
Yeah.
different topics.
I don't even know how much time has passed, but it just felt like
Yeah, we're
we've
like
just gotten
42
started.
minutes. Just goes by so fast. I know you're nearing the end of your day in London, and you've been very gracious with your time, and I really do appreciate it. I want to be respectful of your time, but I'd love to have a round two sometime if you're game.
Yeah, totally down for it.
Awesome. Well, we're going to have our all this information on the landing page. We'll have your full video there. We'll have links to Search Smartly, and also like what would be the best way for someone to reach out to you if they just want to say hello or if they're interested in the product?
Yeah, I mean, we have a little chat box on our website at searchsmartly.co. You can drop us a message. I read all of them. So that's
Great.
another thing as a founder that I just haven't been able to let go. When we get inquiries from users or comments or feedback, or even just messages looking for help or support because maybe they weren't able to find what they were looking for through our search tool. I'm the guy who gets the messages. So I'm just sort of really passionate about what we can do to improve the user experience and so on. So if you drop us a chat message, it will come straight to me. Um, and yeah, I mean, otherwise I'm on LinkedIn, Taha Dar, and obviously you can reach me by email, taha@searchsmartly.co. So I'm all ears.
Great. Well, I appreciate you living this out. You're definitely an inspiration for founders and the right way to go about things. I think that I've seen so many founders that are passionate about just making money without thinking that like money is a side effect of adding value. And you're starting
Mhm.
with passion for the problem and solving that. And I'm
Yeah.
confident you guys are going to be successful because like, I mean, that's just a fantastic foundation, and it's an excellent problem to solve as well.
Thanks, Jim. Really appreciate the kind words.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time. I hope you have a nice evening. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Have a good
All
one.
right. Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.